So if we could begin then, our first speaker is Dr. Holly Dugan, who will be speaking to us today. I'm very excited about this, on perfume and impossible histories. So if we could welcome Holly, I think maybe.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. I want to thank Marcia and Karen and Joan and Bev as well. And that poem is a really beautiful introduction to my talk, which is called The Smell of Space. I am going to be making a simple argument that smell is a really important component of breathing, and it is a trace of the human. And so one of the ways I want to offer a provocation to us is to think of perfume as an interesting art object that allows us to theorize what it means to breathe in spaces. You might be familiar thinking of perfume as a commodity, but the perfumes that I'm going to share today ask us to do something different, and I think show that potential. And so just as a forewarning, I am circulating scents. They're probably faded by now. It shouldn't be too powerful, but again, perfume is a powerful object as part of my argument. And so if you prefer not to engage in that, just pass it along, and I'll be sure to bin them at the end so it doesn't linger in the room. The one caveat is that there is one scratch and sniff that if you do engage, the scent will linger on your hand for the rest of the panel. So you may want to find me afterwards where you can engage and then wash your hand if you're interested. Okay. My talk today explores connections between science fiction, the senses, space, and embodiment. How do we imagine places that are defined beyond the human, places indeed hostile to human life, underwater, outer limits, the prehistoric past, the harrowing past, the infinite future? What does it mean to imaginatively inhabit these spaces, even if it is only through fictive structures? And what might a methodology defined by its relationship to humanity, phenomenology, have to offer such inquiries? My first keyword is human. Olfaction is absolutely essential to human life, a point that many scholars, artists, poets, and scientists who study smell often emphasize. Though many are born without the sense of smell and some of us lose it through old age or traumatic brain injury, olfaction as a sensory modality is often connected with the essential aspects of human experience: disgust, desire, death. For most of us, to smell is to breathe. We breathe about 23,000 times a day, anywhere between 12 and 25 times a minute, which means during the course of my talk, you may inhale anywhere from 180 to 375 times. This means you will smell the air in the room, our breakfasts, our pens, the carpet, the perfumes, the sighs of boredom, the fatigue, the inhalations of understanding, and hopefully also of inspiration. Our bodily materiality is part of that process. Though we often theorize this through the other senses, sight, space, sound, the environment, touch, intimacy, taste, pleasure, smell is easily also one of collectivity and also of bodily decay. It is built into the verb itself, at least in English. Consider the transitive, the infinitive to smell. It's not immediately clear whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. Are you a subject or an object who smells? To ask such a question is to straddle the divide, the bestial, celestial divide. Smell is both the stuff of gods and the butt of many, many, many jokes. Language is a key element to this process. Language and sensation work together to create a powerful experience, one that is visceral and embodied, but one that also points towards absent presences and present absences. Keyword visceral. Air permeates us, connecting the inner realm of our bodies to the outer world. It's a fundamental part of quotidian life, so much so that we rarely can consciously think about it. In my book, I made much of this fact, arguing that literature functioned as a particularly rich and important archive of sensory history. Here's my second. Cute. Offering us a way to do something counterintuitive and often thought to be impossible. And I'm recognizing the irony in the room, with Phil in the room, but that is to historicize olfaction. Defined in paradoxical ways as subjective and material, transhistorical and ephemeral, smell often is thought to resist traditional historical methodologies and traditional approaches to historical preservation. And despite our desire to encounter a whiff of the past, we can't. Fascinating attempts to try and recreate it, however, can inspire us to think about what it might mean to be visceral in such spaces. And I'm thinking here of attempts like the recent Perfume that tried to capture the smell of the Morgan Library circa 1905, as reported in the New York Times. That technology drew on headspace technology to capture a smell of decaying paper books, of oiled leather bindings, of cigars, the fleeting smell of Morgan's mistress's perfume, and perhaps also the aroma of horse dung from outside. That's a quote. It's a poetic creation made of perfume, not an accurate encounter. In some ways, it's a false frontier. Historical phenomenology does the same, emphasizing instead the pleasures of a historicized literary description, a kind of zygote formed from the philosophical traditions of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Edmund Husserl, and from a Marxist-inflected materialism. Historical phenomenology as a literary methodology opened up new ways to think about perception itself having a history. I tend to prefer this because it focuses more on absences rather than the imagined and overemphasized presences, such as the men in that reading room, rather than the women and the men excluded from it. But I'm a literary critic, and this is my bias. And I've come to appreciate perfumed experiences that encourage us to think about social space. How, for instance, do we imagine cities to smell? Cities in the past. Who is imagined to inhabit them, and who has been removed from them to make these imagined mental maps and the material, shared, collective, environmental realities possible in terms of the public health? Perfume, I want to argue, allows us to confront in visceral and embodied ways not only our assumptions about the past, but also perhaps impossible histories. And this is a term that comes from a really interesting perfume exhibition in 2008 by Robert Blackson. Histories, these are histories that are rarely narrated, or when they are, exceed our capacity to grapple with them intellectually as well as effectively. How might thinking through the smell of impossible spaces and smell in impossible spaces help us to better understand these scholarly approaches to the present and past? Keyword unsettled. For example, Unsettled, a bespoke perfume commissioned by the Nevada Museum of Art, examines the history of violence embedded within luxury perfumes as commodities, citing both histories of colonization that transform plants and animals into perfume notes, and the future devastation of climate change that comes from the same sort of systems. Unsettled links the pleasure of perfume to these histories of violence in profoundly unintended, unsettling ways. The perfume's sweet scent is transcendent. It creates an encounter through juxtaposition by asking the smeller to situate themselves intimately and embodied ways to those histories, or to choose to ignore them. And you can see here how it draws on an earlier 1930s perfume, Colony by Jean Pateau. Okay. Stephen Pierce's perfume recreation of Jesse Taroffo's Last Breakfast. Oops. Stephen Pierce's perfume recreation of Jesse Taroffo's Last Breakfast instead emphasizes perfume as a ghostly echo. Taroffo's Last Breakfast creates a spicy and sweet melange of smells, asking us to smell his humanity that the US government and the state of Florida extinguished in 2008. These impossible histories inhabit the history of power, asking us to breathe in its wake through perfume. If we go further back in time, we can see how this paradox of smell and human experience is present in perfume's medicinal history. In times of plague, any strong scent was a reminder of the body's vulnerability to shared air. Sweet smells and strong smells could protect a person, a kind of perfume prophylactic. But these scents also became conflated with the presence of contagion, shifting symbolic meanings. For example, rosemary's dominance as a plague preventative shifted its symbolic meanings in times of plague. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a play that features an outbreak of plague, Rosemary is a metaphor and a prop. Juliet's nurse teases her that does not Rosemary and Romeo begin with R, both symbolizing death. Later, Rosemary was linkly strewn on her grave as bridal flowers, indexing the tragedy of that play. Ophelia is also reminds her brother Laertes in Hamlet that Rosemary is an herb of remembrance, right before she drowns herself in madness and grief. Such literary allusions demonstrate how smell and certain smells become associated with collective memory. Shakespeare draws on these to stage visceral effects with his audience. He also uses smell to demarcate an extreme absence of vitality, imagining quitting Earth for a more sterile promontory in the heavens, escaping what he describes as its canopy of air, which is foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. The earth is hostile to him. He articulates his melancholic desire as escape from this realm. And he emphasizes man's humanity, describing it as a quintessence of dust. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. There we go. Keyword dust. The notion that space has a smell is not new. Medieval and Renaissance scientists long posited that the celestial spheres were related to human body and sensory modalities. In Ptolemaic arrangements of the zodiac man, the planets influenced the senses. The sun governed sight, the moon taste, Venus governed smell, Mercury speech, Jupiter touch. Such a notion was expanded in the Renaissance with anatomy science. The body became a space in and of itself. Like the macro expanse of the cosmos above, it had infinitely small worlds within it, a point made clear in Hilkiah Crook's title for his medical treatise, Microcosmographia. But some scientists hypothesized that this worked in the reverse as well. Renaissance polymath Geronimo Cortes, for instance, posited that Mars was red and spice, Venus was blue and musky, Saturn was black and acidic. Or Cardano posited that Mars was blue and salty and Saturn was bitter and black, and Venus was white and sweet. It's tempting to dismiss such links between the inner space of the body and the outer space of the cosmos as outmoded technologies. Yet this notion of particle, of dust, for me, opens up ways to continue the limits and confront the limits of both spaces in the past and spaces that we might need to inhabit in the future. To think about the smell of space is to engage with environments hostile to human life, but it is also to recognize that space shares some of the same chemicals found in Earth's environments. Methane, for instance, a gas that defines the smell of the large gas giants, is also linked to the swarms of Earth. And for instance, Sagittarius B2, a dust cloud at the center of our universe, is comprised mostly of ethylformine, a chemical that gives raspberries their unique taste and is also associated with the smell of rum. Or to turn to planets closer to home, such as Venus, which is comprised mostly of sulfuric acid and thus is imagined to smell of rotten eggs. I'll skip for time, I'm getting close. But such a smell profile is linked to ours. To think about the sensorium of space is to engage with the materiality of worlds other than our own, a point that resonates across both macro and micro frontiers. Both the hypothetical positing of visceral experience of smell and sound environments, but also our ability to describe such realms in terms that relate to human and personal histories. And this, I think, is something we were talking about yesterday, how we can use perfume potentially as a connection between nature and art and reality. It also means engaging with futures and with our environment is as hostile as space. This is the last one. And this is the imagined smell of Earth once it's become uninhabitable, smelled from the environment of space. So, method, keyword method. When we as humans tend to imagine ourselves in these environments, they remain structured by earthly materiality. You may find yourself resisting my claim about the usefulness of perfume at creating alternative or extreme environments, but consider this. NASA commissioned a bespoke perfume meant to simulate the air inside the International Space Station after realizing how powerful these perfume creations are at capturing a rarefied experience. It's now used to acclimate astronauts to the unique living environment of the International Space Station, a place that smells of both space and of Earth. And in the book, you can turn to the additional one, which is the Mir Space Station, and the smell of it. As you inhale this last perfume, try to find your own words to describe it. Doing so will undoubtedly lead you to structures of recollection into your own personal histories of places you've lingered and persons with whom you've shared air. This is often described as a problem. What we lack is a precise language of olfaction. But it is this imprecision, I argue, that allows us to float between worlds, ours and the universe's. And it is on this point that I'll end my talk. Describing the smell clinging to their spacesuits after a spacewalk, astronauts used a wide variety of metaphors. These on their own seem to point to different accounts of the smell of space and to the wide array of cultural variants of smell on Earth. They described it as seared steak, walnuts, brake pads, welding, burnt almond cookies, and cordite. Is this useful data? Some seem disparate, welding, steak, but they're also linked to polycyclical aroma chemicals of burning ozone smell. Cookies and cordite are harder. How can space smell both like the smell of a gun and the smell of burnt almond cookies? The answer is that there are different people experiencing it. And that description of cordite signals a visceral experience of shooting a gun, but the astronauts cite outmoded technology since cordite hasn't been used as a propellant in guns since 1945. Modern guns use smokeless powder as a propellant, which is comprised of the same chemical. Others describe this as a memory of burnt cookies, drawing on that experiential difference that's so key. Hell, quantum physics, explosive, and cookies. The smell of space is a material reality, yet it is one that is rooted in both science and fiction. To encounter the smell of space, we must encounter the smells of Earth and to begin to think about how our visceral perception shape and delimit, and sometimes dramatically curtail, the radical potential of these new frontiers, and perhaps the old ones as well. Thank you.